because I think that there's a direct continuity between what happens to Afeni Shakur, what happens to Frank Trugy Jr. Right there, those old COINTELPRO actions are sort of the the forerunners of these tactics, right? Of these tactics of the war on terror, and the difference is, and I think we're going to point it out here in a second, is that this is much more the FBI's speed, right? It's really hard. It's really hard to kill Castro, but it's really easy. It's really easy to get a depressed teenager, to do what you want, right? And so it's more their speed. And I think most Americans accept that the Cold War era CIA and FBI were like cartoonishly evil, but I think less known is that they were also shockingly incompetent.
My favorite part of, I think, that era of like CIA, American state like espionage is just like the absurd amount of like ridiculous spy technology that they just wasted millions of dollars on to like fucking get these people, and it just never worked.
I mean,
never worked.
Yeah, how many million dollars? Yeah, how many millions of dollars?
No, like how many fucking little fake flies did they create to fly into Castro's house, to try
right. or even just like, here's some poison pills, get one of them into Fidel Castro's drink. Never, and I don't, we have.
It is funny though. Like you have to sit back and look at it. Like this is hilarious that they wasted this much effort, trying to do this.
You have this just unprecedented intelcom associated with the American state, that it can't kill some bearded commie 90 miles off of Key West, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, they were really good at getting inside leftist organizations.
Yeah, but there's a Hollywood movie now about how Bill O'Neill got Fred Hampton killed by the FBI.
Okay, but what about in Chile?
Actually, one of the things that most like pointy-headed centrists who know about Chile, and that's a small group of people, who will come back at you when you talk about how the CIA overthrew Allende or whatever. They'll come back and they'll quickly point out how the CIA utterly failed to prevent Allende from coming to power, and then failed to even get the military to step in after he come to power, and that the very fact that Allende even got to the point where he's putting his hand on a Bible, right, is usually held up as proof of the failure of the CIA and the intelligence community to intervene there, right?
Mm-hmm. So we have the American intelligence community blundering through Cold War espionage tactics, planning hyper competent violence in statecraft, but ultimately failing at both.
And I think this is the remarkable thing about Americans' perception of the intelligence community, right? Because if you let Hollywood tell you about it, then it's like Jim and Roy from The Office just doming people of color in some sandy backlot in Van Nuys, right? When in reality, it's just like Nixon and Kissinger doing a Blackadder sketch, and then Fidel Castro gets away by painting a black circle on a red wall and just letting the CIA run into it at full speed.
Right. So what then? I mean, like you have a cartoonish intelligence community, with all the capacity to surveil anyone, really anywhere, and they're utterly incapable of using that information to do anything.
Right. And if you want an example of what we're talking about, then go listen to our episode 1 feature.
Right. The story of Afeni Shakur is a good example. I mean, I think of how surveillance prowess outstrips the intelligence community's ability to just do anything with that information at all.
That's right. And we suggested in episode 1 that these things like aren't Cold War ephemera, right? And we wanted to kind of build on that and tell a few stories about what these tactics look like after 9/11, right? After the dawn of the Forever War.
So, like, of course, the target has shifted, instead of, competent organizations really led by charismatic black leftists, the FBI now targets mentally ill young men who fit the profile of the radical Islamic terrorist.
Instead of Afeni Shakur, confident and capable of showing in court the fingerprints of law enforcement on the charges brought against the Panther 21, we have James Cromedy.
Right, but before we get to James Cromedy, we have to introduce Shahid Hussein, and he's the FBI agent, in this first story.
That's right. So according to court records compiled at the prosecution of the Newburgh Four, you want to look them up, Hussein had become an FBI informant in part because of his own past, right? And this is usually how this works, right? After picking up a murder charge in Pakistan, he entered the country on a fake passport, and at some point in this process, right, he gets flipped for the FBI, right? And that's how the story starts, as they so often do.
And the intelligence community gets leverage over, an individual by offering clemency or leniency for, past offenses.
That's right. Go watch Judas and the Black Messiah if you're having a hard time conceptualizing it. It's very good.
So Hussein shows up in, New York, and he starts going to a local mosque.
And it's a pretty standard Muslim community for the United States. Good relationships to other communities of faith, relatively cosmopolitan interpretations of the radical pieces of Islam.
So this means that Hussein, he stood out when he started extolling the more conservative parts of the faith.
That's right. And in 2009, 4 members of the mosque were arrested for a plot to use bombs and missiles against U.S. military, law enforcement, and other communities of faith.
A Stinger missile.
Right. Which is where we should enter James Cromedy, who recruited the other 3 members of the Newburgh Four while Hussein slinked back into the shadows.
And all of these guys, Cromedy included, were impoverished people of color, like many who live in Newburgh.
At one point, Cromedy sold a camera given to him by Hussein to take pictures of targets, right? And even stopped returning the FBI agent's phone calls, at which point Hussein suggested that the fictional operatives that they were working with would kill Cromedy if he backed out at that point. So we have the target of this investigation trying to extricate themselves, as we're going to see in a couple of these cases, right? And the FBI, literally saying, no, the people we're working for will kill you if you don't, do a terrorist attack.
Right. And the judge who sent the Newburgh Four to jail said, only the government could have made a terrorist out of Mr. Cromedy. A man whose buffoonery is positively Shakespearean in its scope. And I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that there would have been no crime here except the government instigated it, planned it, and brought it to fruition.
In addition to enticing poor people to commit acts of terror, one of the Newburgh Four included a man with severe mental illness, to the point that they found bottles of urine stored in his apartment, right?
So ultimately, these guys weren't even militants. They were just poor and ignorant.
Right, and they probably thought they were playing this weird rich guy who kept offering them money and vacations.
Exactly.
And I mean the fellow who was weakest and most vulnerable to this, right? Apparently, mostly just showed up to eat the free food, and
right.
And so now let's talk about Khalil Abu Rayyan, right? An all-American fail son, right? His parents owned a pizzeria in Dearborn Heights, Michigan.
Before Rayyan was even a teenager, he told a teacher actually that he had a dream about committing a school shooting, and he struggled through high school. And at the end of all this, ended up working in his parents' business at the pizzeria.
Things took a turn when Rayyan was arrested driving his car while in possession of marijuana and an unlicensed firearm.
Rayyan got radicalized online, and he started posting, the types of things you might expect, posing with guns, writing the slogans of various organizations on his profile, and making declarations of violence against non-believers.
That's right. It's at this point that Rayyan was contacted by 2 FBI agents who were posing as teenage girls.
And these agents, tried to entice Rayan, using the fictional personas of two teenage girls to encourage Rayan to commit suicide in a final act of violent jihad.
It was only when Rayan told the second female persona that he wasn't interested, that he'd rather just kill himself and not harm anyone, that federal agents at last arrested Rayan on the same gun charge as from the original arrest.
So it's clear that there is a picture starting to emerge here. The FBI is finding individuals who, fit the profile and then begin planning, these terrorist attacks around them.
Yeah, the FBI
and with them
plans terrorist attacks for alienated, marginal people who fit a certain profile.
And of course, with the myth of hyper-competent violence sold to us in movies and television, it's easy to imagine the FBI sweeping in to neutralize a threat as the clock on that bomb ticks to zero.
Right. Except in the real world, they likely supplied all the means and material to carry out the attack, which means if you don't get to the bomb before time runs out, then the state just carried out a false flag terror operation on its own population.
Right. And why would they care? A successful attack guarantees increased perpetual funding to that agency and the overall department, guarantees those limp-dick politicians and cowering masses, would pass a blank check to the very architects of, that operation.
Right. So now we enter Adel Daoud. In 2018, he pled guilty to a terrorism charge alleging that he had tried to detonate a 1,000-pound car bomb outside a bar in downtown Chicago.
And similar to Rayan, Dowd had the usual paper trail of violent religious ideology online.
Things really took off when the agents began to exchange messages with Dowd in 2012. Agents met with Dowd to select a target, plan the attack, and even drove him to pick up the bomb.
And then they let Dowd drive what he thought was a bomb to the outside of the Cactus Grill, where they swarmed him and arrested him ultimately.
So whether or not Dowd was of sound mind before this, it became clear in the court proceedings that the experience of being lured by agents to commit a terrorist attack, arriving on the cusp of the action, and then being arrested by the FBI was destabilizing for Dowd.
And he actually got a relatively lenient sentence. His attorney made an effective defense around his overall deteriorating mental health and the role of the feds in this case.
The judge actually let him enter an Alford plea, which is where you acknowledge the facts of the case to be accurate but maintain your innocence.
And the state actually appealed Dowd's 16-year sentence, hoping it would be extended.
Earlier this month, his attorney began trying to withdraw the original guilty plea.
So, what do we make of these tactics?
There's a concerted effort within the Intelcom to work with suspected terrorists to plan attacks in which the feds can intervene and publicly claim success. Ultimately, there were never any Stinger missiles in Newburgh. Khalil Rayan wouldn't even do a mass shooting that he believed was personally requested by a teenage girl. And the only reason Adel Daoud had a target and believed he had a car bomb was because he'd spent months planning it with the FBI, all to ensure perpetual funding and make a case to politicians for extending a blank check to the domestic side of the United States forever war.
And I mean, what we see is that this is more of the speed of the intelligence community. It's hard to poison Castro's cigar or get, the Chilean legislature to reject the results of an open and fair election. But it's easy to get, some impoverished, mentally ill person entrap themselves in a false flag terror operation. And if we know about these cases, then there's probably others.
And what do we make of the Tsarnaev brothers who did the Boston Marathon bombing? What about the guy who drove that van into Nashville and blew himself up? How about the other guy who set himself up in that hotel in Vegas and shot into the audience of an outdoor concert? Or any of the other strange, conspicuously well-equipped acts of domestic terror that we're encouraged to just not think too hard about?
The point is that the intelligence community doesn't always choose hapless, incompetent people for these kinds of strategies. I mean, those are just the ones, we find out about, and we should ask ourselves who are the others and what might go wrong as the FBI entices members of the overall population to commit heinous acts of violence against the public.
I think we're going to see people rhetorically reach to feudalism as a way to explain changes in capitalism, and especially in capital's relationship to the state. I think much like feudalism as a term, as like a problematic term, I think probably that's just going to happen. People are going to, Jeff Bezos is going to start like appointing Supreme Court justices and people are going to say that's feudalism. And if you're not beholden to the kind of Marxist definition of feudalism as a mode of production, but sort of more of like a culturalist or juridical conception of feudalism, then that makes sense, right? And I think probably for like me and the 20 other people who like give a shit about making sure that people use the word feudalism correctly, we're gonna be like, damn it, you're missing the point. But I don't think we can do anything about it. We just kind of have to accept it. I'm Nick Rogers. I'm a PhD student in medieval history at Yale University, and I work on the social history of the early European Middle Ages. Right, so one of the things that I work on are monasteries, right? And I think that to probably like modernists and non-specialists, that's, you hear like, oh, this person works in monasteries, they must be interested in like cultural and probably religious history. It's not that I'm like not interested in those things. They're just not, I'm a social historian at the end of the day. And the reason that I'm interested in monasteries, especially in the sort of early central Middle Ages, is because, well, one, because they're like repositories of written sources, right? So a lot of what we know about the way that like land tenure works, we know about because in addition to sort of secular lords being landlords, monasteries were also landlords. And so we can look at the sort of charter evidence and have a pretty good sense indirectly of what private as opposed to monastic or ecclesiastical landlordship looked like. And then the other reason that I'm interested in these is because I think that I'm interested in the idea of the early medieval state, right? And that's sort of, if you're an early medievalist and you're interested in states, you have to make kind of like one of two moves. You can either do what is at this point kind of like whole-scale revisionism and say that actually, in point of fact, we totally subscribe to the language we find within Carolingian sources that talks about all this like public shit that we're doing. Or you can say, and so then you basically are in the position of saying like the Carolingian state basically looked like a modern state. The other thing you can do is say, I want to move beyond sort of the orthodox Weberian definition of a state and look at other ways that like a governmentality sort of arises. And I think monasteries are one place that you can do that, because I think what is true and is very unique about early medieval Europe is that power is the way that power is exercised and the way these like relations are instantiated is really personal, right? In the sense that like your social tie to the person who is exploiting your labor is usually one degree. That's a person who you know, right? And what monasteries let us kind of do is look at these much more local circuits of interpersonal power and authority and see how those get sort of plugged into by more distant kind of centralizing state apparatuses, right? So for any early medieval ruler who has pretensions to saying that, he is a king and an emperor and not just like one lord among other lords, is being able to sort of like project power into the localities. And one of the only ways you can do that without sort of modern technologies of statecraft is to tap into these and to sort of like subscribe these local networks into the state project and to show local elites that you have something to gain by kind of being part of the state, right? And I think that monasteries, Farfa included, partly because it's one of these so-called imperial monasteries, that's really where the rubber hits the road, I think, in terms of the way that rule is actualized in this period.
Well, let's tell us about Farfa, and if you could, in the story that you're recounting in the paper, as sort of as one narrative.
Sure. Yeah. So Farfa is a Benedictine abbey that is in central Italy in the Sabina. So it's about 50 kilometers outside of Rome. And what I'm interested in is this period from about 897 until 930, when the monks at Farfa are expelled from their monastery. The reasons for this expulsion are a little bit hazy. It's attributed by one of the chroniclers to raids by sort of like Muslim pirates, but there's also a lot of sort of domestic political turmoil going on in this period. So what basically happens is that these monks are kicked out of their abbey, and it's sort of a technical term for those of us who are not like medievalists or I guess Catholics, right? What distinguishes an abbey from a monastery is that an abbey is like a monastery that's in charge of other monasteries. So Farfa is not just the complex of buildings at Farfa, but it's also its dependent monasteries, its sort of satellite branches. So from 897 until roughly 930, we don't know exactly, the sort of the administrative core of this monastic institution, of this abbatial institution, is in exile. It's moving around. They split into 3 different parties. One of those parties we think is completely wiped out. The other 2, one goes to Rome. And so the reason this is an interesting case study for me is that we have an abbey, right? So a kind of important institution in the sort of like constitution of a society and of a state in this period, being like totally dislocated. So what I was curious about is like, well, how do these monks, despite spending 30 years away from the seat of their power, nevertheless kind of come back and return to prominence and continue to play a really important role, not just in Central Italian, but really in European politics for the next several centuries, right? So this is like a study basically in elite resilience, right? The ways that even when faced with these seemingly serious crises, that nevertheless the sort of like old patterns of exploitation and rule reproduce themselves and persist. I think, we were seeing this at the beginning of COVID, people saying like, oh, is this, there's always this kind of like, well, is this going to be the big one, the thing that finally kind of throws capitalism into its final crisis? And like time and again, that just has not, unfortunately, been the case. So, and it's not to say that like anyone who wants to understand modern capitalist crises needs to be like an expert in early medieval monasteries, but just that they are one of many kind of like useful sites of inquiry if we want to think about how power holds on. The specific case of Farfa is a interesting and important case study in a sort of a type of institution and a certain approach to governance. Having said that, I think there is really a case for looking at Farfa and sort of central and northern Italy in this period, so the 9th and 10th centuries, as really of a piece with the broader Carolingian and post-Carolingian world. And I think that for the sort of story of the kind of political economy of the Middle Ages and how that develops, that is sort of the most fruitful frame. Charlemagne basically establishes this empire. He conquers numerous sort of pagan Germanic tribes and extends his rule, at least formally, sort of basically down roughly to Rome on the Italian peninsula, but also into the Iberian Peninsula, everything that is now sort of France and Germany. Very quickly, this sort of starts to fall apart. The sort of subsequent generations of Carolingian rulers divide up the empire roughly into three kingdoms. And the degree, the speed and the degree to which the Carolingian state apparatus falls apart is a matter of like a lot of contention. But it's to say that, you know, Farfa is one of these institutions that is important before the Carolingians come to Italy, and it's important while they're there, and it continues to be important after they have left and can sort of, you know, no longer project power into the peninsula. But so that is, I guess, in a nutshell, that's the Carolingian world.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Charlemagne represents sort of this alternate node of power in Europe, whereas you have sort of the papacy, right, as an arbiter of ecclesiastical authority. And then throughout the sort of decline of power as it was based in Rome, you get this second node that exists sort of out in Europe more broadly, right? And so we're situating Farfa between those two worlds, between the ecclesiastical authority of the Pope in Rome versus the sort of harder hegemonic powers of what we could think of as the imperial Catholic system.
We tend to think about separations between church and state and between material and spiritual power, right? And some of that is due to, you know, the actual intellectual history of the church in the Central and later Middle Ages. A lot of that is also, for those of us who are North Americans, these are things that we like learn about in school as part of American civics, right? But in this period, right, so in the early and Central Middle Ages, sort of, I mean, I'm really interested in like the world pre the year 1000. Not only is the church itself and the papacy as part of the church, not only are they spiritual authorities, but they're also very powerful landowners and political and military actors in their own right. So they do exercise a temporal authority. So it's not sort of as if you merely have the church managing sort of the ideological and spiritual world that people inhabit, and the Carolingians sort of dictating the terms of government on the ground, but really they are kind of both doing both. And the other thing to say here is that we'd certainly be mistaken in this period to think of the Catholic Church as a monolithic institution oriented towards a singular set of goals with which everyone is broadly in line, right? So, you know, the Pope is often at odds with various bishops. Monks are often at odds with their local bishops and will try to form alliances either with secular powers or with the papacy at the expense of their obligations to their local bishop. So it's basically extremely messy. And I think thinking about it in terms of an opposition between two camps or in between sort of qualitatively different ways of exercising power, it sort of obscures more than it reveals.
Okay. Now I'd like you to just like spend a second talking about sort of how we get from, you know, Rome on the one hand to this kind of world where, you know, whereas you're saying you have this sort of messy power sharing sort of that's sitting on the structure of the church, and kind of by extension the structure of the church being the last vestiges of Roman authority, right? And that, you know, how should we understand kind of that process of decline to the point where you know, where the Pope is the vestige of this old institutional power and the church more broadly.
If we're talking about the old institutional power of like, so if we're talking about, if when you say Rome, you're talking about imperial Rome, right? I mean, you know, we're in sort of a funny situation here in the sort of in the sort of back end of the early Middle Ages, where you have, I mean, this is true throughout the early Middle Ages, where you have multiple people or multiple institutions essentially claiming to be the rightful heirs of the Roman Empire, right? I mean, the Carolingians do this. The Roman Empire continues to exist in the East, right? And they have a claim that they exercise sometimes quite effectively to what's happening on the Italian peninsula. There are multiple schools of thought about how we should look at the Carolingian world in light of what comes before it in both the preceding Merovingian dynasty, but also the world of Roman late antiquity and classical antiquity. And there's sort of a maximalist continuationist school who look at what is now France in this period and say, well, we have a large population that is ethnically sort of Romano-Gallic, right? And then we also have like a Germanic ruling aristocracy. I mean, I think that this clean dichotomy has broken down a lot in the last couple of decades. But that's just to say that there is, a school of historians who really do see these as successor states to the Roman Empire in the strongest sense of the term. And then you have others who see this as in terms of kind of complete rupture, and that there's not really anything we could even call a state in the Carolingian world. There is no Carolingian state. There are sort of pretensions to public power and to being a state, but that we can't actually really talk about it as actually existing. Feudalism is like feudalism and its sort of cognate and related terms are similarly messy, maybe even worse. The sort of English term feudalism actually comes from a 12th century legal text called the Libri Feodorum, right, which is basically a set of rules about how the relationship between lord and vassal should be understood and litigated. And you have sort of 19th century and early 20th century medievalists saying like, well, this is evidence of a stable system that expands throughout Europe, and these were the contours of society, or kind of as we find them in this law text. And that is sort of like an edifice of historiography that has been completely demolished at this point. So there's a very good reason that a lot of medievalists don't like to talk about feudalism or feudal society or a feudal mode of production. And I'm very sympathetic to that debate. I think it's, a deeply unfortunate term that we're kind of left with. Having said that, I think that if you define your terms well, I don't really have any problem kind of talking about at least a feudal mode of production. I think where this gets a little messier is that you have certain schools of historiography where you have, Marxists like myself talking about feudalism interchangeably with the feudal mode of production, and really like a Marxist sense of mode of production, talking with and often past other historians who are using the term feudalism a little more loosely to refer to a set of, cultural practices, certain kinds of legal and juridical institutions. So in terms of the feudal mode of production, right, I think one of the important things to say, right, is that Marx himself, he does talk a little bit about medieval Europe. He's much more interested in classical antiquity, but really what he's actually interested, right, in is capitalism. And I think the work of building a robust Marxist historiography of medieval Europe and of the feudal mode of production has been left to subsequent scholars, right? I have sort of no problem saying that like Marx didn't really have all that much to say about feudalism. But, one of Marx's main projects, right, was to show that what appear to be universal economic laws of capitalism are actually historically contingent and not universal, right? So we should try to figure out, well, what are the economic laws and the economic features of the feudal mode of production? Probably the best single person to read on this, and someone whose scholarship I've relied on tremendously, is Chris Wickham, who's a medieval historian. He also does a lot of work with archaeology. In particular, if you want to maybe put this in show notes or something, he has an essay. It's called Productive Forces and the Economic Logic of the Feudal Mode of Production from 2008. It's really excellent. A lot of what I'm about to say sort of follows from that. Anyway, so one of the things that Wickham says in this article is that, it's useful and even important to develop as clear a picture as we can of the economic laws of the most substantial and long-lasting non-capitalist mode of production yet to have existed in history since the development of class hierarchies. The last part of that may come as a shock to a lot of people, because I think when most people hear feudalism or the word feudal, they think like medieval Europe. They think about castles, knights, jousting, chivalry, that kind of thing, right? But at the same time, the European Middle Ages as a field of study have been sort of significantly provincialized in the public consciousness. And that's not necessarily been for bad reasons or entirely, to our detriment. But it's just to say that if you're sort of coming to feudalism with those associations, then the claim that the feudal mode of production is the most substantial and long-lasting in history is going to probably seem very Eurocentric, right? There's also been a tendency among Marxist historians of pre-modern societies and the pre-capitalist past to look at sort of state-based tax and tribute systems. So this would include like the Roman Empire, but also places as diverse as like the Aztecs, right? Or like numerous sort of Chinese dynasties, right? As being modally different from landlord-based systems of exploitation, which we see in medieval Western Europe, a little bit later in Imperial Russia, and I guess also in Japan in certain periods of its history, as well as elsewhere, right? And that is a distinction that a lot of people hold on to, and I think that's probably fine. For Wickham, and I think I kind of agree with him here, all of these societies, right, both, I mean, whatever's going on in medieval Europe, but also what's happening previously in the Roman Empire, can be seen as part of the same larger mode of production insofar as they're based, at the end of the day, on forcibly extracting surplus from peasant families who are the primary producers, right? And because of that messy history of the term feudal that I sort of just alluded to, it's probably not like desirable or useful to be like, well, to tell a historian of the Aztec Empire, like, actually what you're talking about is feudalism, right? Because feudalism looks really different in Europe in the year 700 than it does in Mexico in the 16th century, right? But maybe we can talk about feudalism as being like a particular historical instantiation of this mode of production. So we have like one piece of our definition here, right, which is the extraction of surplus from peasant families as primary producers. The other sort of big thing that distinguishes feudal from capitalist production is that under the latter, labor processes are directly controlled, well, by capitalists nowadays more often than not by like managers, and the sort of the free appearance of the labor contract obscures the fact of exploitation, right? Which the fact that labor is paid for less than the value of what it creates. In the feudal mode of production, producers themselves, so the peasant family, right? And we shouldn't necessarily think about the peasant family as like a nuclear modern family, right? But this sort of peasant household is the basic like unit of production, and they are in control of the labor process, and surplus is being extracted from them out in the open. I mean, it is ideologically justified in a bunch of different ways. Religion and theology have a huge part to play here. But these justifications are very diverse. They contain their own contradictions, and they're never totally unchallenged, right? But they do exist, and I think in aggregate, they accomplish their job, right, of securing consent to exploitation.
To what extent can we understand feudalism as a term that's had to carry a lot of intellectual shorthand for the space between slavery and, you know, the industrialized proletarian worker, and having to pick up every space in between, the term itself, you know, ends up being less useful than it might otherwise be.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's like sort of I think the downside of Wickham's framing is that you can wind up in a position where you're right, you have capitalism, you have feudalism, much more rarely you have a slave mode of production, and everything in between that is just feudalism. That said, I think that the sort of common through line of forcible extraction of what is, you know, agrarian production, right, is sort of the part of this that I like want to kind of hang on to here. The case for treating things like Rome and, say, the Carolingian world as being parts of the same like broader mode of production is that even where you may have other modes of production kind of existing side by side, I mean, I think this is something that really comes out of kind of like Althusserian historiography, is that you can have multiple modes of production coexisting, but that one will be dominant, right? And so even in like a tax or tributary state, the extraction that is happening, whether it's tax or tribute or something else, is ultimately being directly taken from primary producers, right? And so taxes might be paid in produce themselves, or they might be paid in labor. The labor could be agricultural labor that is carried out on land directly owned by a private lord, or it could be labor that goes towards what now we would think of as like public works projects, right? So like maintenance of roads, irrigation systems, digging canals, fortifying dams, right? And then even in societies where you have fairly developed market exchange, you may also have peasants paying their taxes in cash, right? And then it's also the case that you'll find peasants under the feudal mode of production producing for the market, sometimes very extensively. But as a general rule, they are still meeting their subsistence needs first. And this is what basically distinguishes even a kind of market-oriented feudalism from, say, like agro-capital style cash cropping, right? Which is historically, in the pre-modern period, very rare. I think some people make a case for like Sicily in the Middle Ages being sort of like a region that specializes in wheat production to the exclusion of almost anything else, but that's like very much anomalous, right? So, I mean, like capitalism, right? I mean, part of the reason that we're having this conversation, right, is because we're curious about like ways that capitalism is changing and starting to look very different from what it looked like in Marx's day, for instance, right? But so much like capitalism, feudalism is really flexible and very adaptive, right? And as I was saying before, there's a strong tendency among historians who are maybe not working within the Marxist tradition in my field to associate feudalism very closely with the collapse or the absence of any kind of public or state, although these terms are often sort of conflated with each other, apparatus or any kind of public sphere or a state that's distinct from civil society. And I think this is kind of what you were getting at, Mike, in terms of like sort of the devolution or the degradation of public institutions. And while that is I think, widespread and important feature of medieval Western societies in this period, and that it may proceed from the specific way that the feudal mode of production was instantiated there, I don't think that is necessarily a necessary outcome of the feudal mode of production. So that's to say that feudalism is totally happy existing where the state is strong, as whereas where the state is weak or even practically non-existent.
Have you read Dune?
I have read Dune, yeah.
So Dune predicts a point in humanity's future where society has completely rejected any notion of high technology, any notion of mechanical advancement, especially to sort of replace human labor, right? And that the event that hangs over the world of Dune is the Butlerian Jihad, right? Which is a very short period in the context of this fictive world, right? Where all of these technologies are essentially purged in favor of, what ends up being sort of a metaphysical mental strength arising from human beings. The implication being that we can return to this sort of order of things, right? Where power is vested in hereditary lines, right? Where the right to resources and the labor above those resources is largely given, by a noble and sort of pseudo-religious authority. How does that portrayal of the progression of society strike a medievalist historian?
I think I love that question. Partly because, for all of its sort of like clunky prose, Dune is like just such a sort of masterpiece of like sci-fi storytelling. And one that people have been trying to ape for mostly for the worse, sort of since it came out. So I think one of the things that's interesting about what you said, right, is that Dune sort of proposes that sort of changes in the mode of production are not unidirectional, right? And I mean, this is something that I agree with personally, and I think also that history furnishes us with plenty of examples of, right? So contrary to a sort of capital O orthodox Marxist or like a G.A. Cohen style like productive force determinism, it's not simply the case that the tools that you have get you a certain political economy, right? From my own period, there's a great example, right? Are Italian city-states sort of shortly after the year 1000, sort of like the 11th and 12th centuries, and even on into the 13th, kind of develop very sophisticated, for their time, financial instruments, but also a textile industry, right? That for all intents and purposes functions within recognizably capitalist parameters, right? There's also a very robust school of sort of classicist historiography that, looks at Rome in much the same way. But what you actually see in the 15th century is elites who have gotten rich off this kind of like early capitalist handicraft industry re-feudalize themselves, and they disinvest from industry and essentially return to landholding because it seems like it's a safer bet, and it's also actually more, in some cases, more profitable for them to go back to directly exploiting peasants than it is to continue, investing in merchant capital at the end of the day, right? And this doesn't just happen in Italy. I mean, it happens sort of throughout Europe in the late medieval and early modern period. Things can move. I mean, I don't want to say backwards because that just kind of gets us back into like a stagist conception of history, but just that these changes are not unidirectional, right? And Dune is sort of a great thought experiment in a way in which they might not be. I don't think the moment we're in now suggests that we're going to return to something like the dynamics of feudalism, or really even what we see in Dune, at least for my kind of like a dim recollection of like how the fictive political economy of Dune works, which admittedly I don't remember all that clearly.
Well, so the kind of idea is that there is still a node of merchant power that endures in that world. The Spacing Guild is the group that's responsible for like the movement of material. And they of course they don't do this through high technology, right? They do it through a psychedelic drug, right? That allows them to see space and time and bend it to their will, right? But of course obviously as a Marxist, you can kind of see the role that's playing here, right? Is that the ability to transport goods in sort of in maybe a post-capitalist but still highly productive society, right? That that this is kind of the big thing that you have to navigate, right? It's just how do you move material, right, when you lack the sort of this broader institutional organization, right? And so and I think this kind of takes me here is why won't Jeff Bezos be the liege lord on my death certificate, right? Because it seems like we might have in a company like Amazon, right? That's something that would have kind of the extant transportational capacity, right? All sort of on this palette of sort of post-capitalist billionaire wealth.
To me, there's no reason why Amazon doesn't become the Spacing Guild.
Right.
So
right. Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I think the Spacing Guild feels to me like the maybe the sort of historical parallel, and maybe this is what Frank Herbert was thinking of, would be something like the Hanseatic League, right? So maybe what Dune is less like a neo-feudalist imaginary than it is a neo-commercial or neo-merchant capitalist imaginary, right? Which is like, I guess, not to do sort of kind of like armchair Marxist lit crit, which is like not my field at all. But it's just to say that that's sort of what the Spacing Guild and maybe what Amazon suggests to me. And part of the reason that I say that is, so like, as you put it, right, why won't Jeff Bezos be the liege lord on my death certificate? I mean, he might be. I really hope not. But I think that the thing about feudalism, as I said, one of the things that I really want to hold on to, in addition to this kind of open exploitation of surplus, right, is the control that primary producers have over the process of production. And that seems to me to be very different from what is happening in these sort of like hyper-rationalized, scientifically managed workplaces, right? Like if you work in an Amazon warehouse, very sad, by the way, that the Bessemer Union Drive seems to have been defeated. That's a huge bummer. But anyway, so that's to say that like if you work in one of those warehouses, you're not in charge of the production process. I mean, okay, granted, now we're sort of like drawing parallels between like logistics work and sort of more traditionally conceived productive labor. But the point is, like, you're not in charge of that process. In fact, every motion that you make, every gesture you do is timed down to like the 10th or the 100th of the second, right? So as long as we have, if we're going to, I think that if feudalism as a mode of production is going to have any sort of like substance and coherence, it's going to be based on sort of those two things, right? Which is exploitation of primary producers openly, not through sort of like fake free wage labor, and that the direct producers are sort of in charge of the actual production process. And I think that without both of those things, you don't have feudalism. And as twisted as capitalism, is and is going probably to get, and as much as Amazon may start to resemble the Spacing Guild, if there is sort of like a movement towards like resembling earlier moments in history, it's maybe commercial capitalism is like the better analog than feudalism is.
Yeah.
And part of that is because, so something that people used to think about the feudal mode of production or the peasant mode of production is that it was sort of necessarily a break on technological innovation because, the peasants don't have an interest in producing a whole bunch of surplus just so that it can get taken away. I think a lot of the more recent like anthropological literature, and again, this is getting like well outside of my field, sort of has pushed back on that and said, well, like, actually peasants think quite hard about what it is they're doing and what they're planting and how they're planting it. But I do think it's the case that sort of what innovation looks like to a primary producer is not going to be the kind of innovation that is like profitable or appealing either to a feudal landlord or to a modern like agro-capitalist, right? I don't see I guess it doesn't seem to me that it would ever be in like Jeff Bezos's interest, right, to start giving to sort of just like outsource like the oversight of the labor process. But
so to zero in on the sort of non-negotiable parts of feudalism, the reason that we can't construct this or should avoid constructing a notion of neo-feudalism, at least as like a predictive tool to analyze the presence, is because in that instance we will misunderstand the peasant and what their actual existence was like. That this is very, very different from the sort of highly managed, industrialized, or even post-industrial labor that we see here today.
Yeah, and you do see throughout the Middle Ages attempts to intensify the exploitation of peasant labor, right? So the domain, right, which is like a domain in a technical sense, are these sort of Carolingian experiments in estate management, right? And we have surviving sources that are sort of almost like business plans for how these things would function ideally. But the basic point of them was to intensify peasant labor and to intensify exploitation. Historically, whenever it's been possible, right, for elites to, at least this is true, in like the pre-modern period, wherever elites can sort of successfully intervene in the peasant labor process and control it or intensify it, this is like really expensive in terms of effort. I think living in not just in a modern state, but also in the sort of imperial core, we tend to view the state as being, on the one hand, extremely incompetent in terms of like providing basic public services for people, but we also tend to view it as being hyper competent at surveilling and basically like surveilling and controlling people, and that some of those capacities have now been taken on by like large corporations, right? Having said that, for most of history and even most of modern history, it's actually really hard for states to do anything. Even just to like collect taxes efficiently is really tough. So which is just to say that, so even where you can intensify like peasant production, it has a tendency to revert eventually, right? Usually after not too long. And it's usually so expensive and difficult to do historically that it usually just doesn't like work out that well from the perspective of like profit maximizing landlords. Yeah.
I think that a lot of times in the imperial core, right, even as Marxists, there's a tendency to sort of accept tacitly that capitalism is an improvement over feudalism, right?
Mhm.
That we are nonetheless happier today as people, than we would have been as peasants, right?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, I certainly don't want to give an overly rosy picture of what life
Sure.
was like for, I mean, even so the Carolingian state, right, which is seen as kind of the high point of medieval public power, was not like a benevolent institution that is like it wasn't good to be a peasant, probably. I think the other thing that's tricky about this is that getting at the day-to-day realities of peasant life in medieval Europe is really, really difficult. I mean, it's almost impossible just because of the nature of the surviving sources. I mean, the people who were producing written documentation that has survived. So, yeah, I mean, I'm very wary of overstating peasant freedom in this period. So we should distinguish between like peasants having control over the immediate labor process, right? Which is basically just that like you're the one who's going to decide how you plant, and nevertheless having like obligations both that you have to meet because you're being sort of coerced to meet them, but also because you may believe in them, right? I mean, a lot of peasant noble conflict in the Middle Ages is not peasants saying we need to abolish this mode of production. It's them saying there's this implicit social contract that we will render surplus to you, and in return you will defend us, and you're not doing that second part, right? But it's not that we don't want lords to exist, it's just that we want you to do that other thing. So we should distinguish between like controlling the labor process and owning the means of production, which are entirely different things. Yeah, I don't know. Part of me is still sort of a if not like a stagist Marxist in terms of thinking that anything is inevitable, that if we are going to have a society in which basically everyone is okay, you do have to sort of build up productive forces to the extent that you can like materially meet those needs. So yeah, I mean, I definitely am not advocating like any kind of a return to feudalism. I just think that it's like I think we're going to see people rhetorically reach to feudalism as a way to explain changes in capitalism, and especially in capital's relationship to the state.
Mm-hmm.
I think much like feudalism as a term, as like a problematic term, I think probably that's just going to happen. People are going to, Jeff Bezos is going to start like appointing Supreme Court justices, and people are going to say that's feudalism. And if you're not beholden to the kind of Marxist definition of feudalism as a mode of production, but sort of more of like a culturalist or juridical conception of feudalism, then that makes sense, right? And I think probably for like me and the 20 other people who like give a shit about making sure that people use the word feudalism correctly, we're going to be like, damn it, you're missing the point. But I don't think we can do anything about it. We just kind of have to accept it. But
here's the thought experiment that I am sort of driving towards, which is that if my children or grandchildren, end up indentured on one of Elon Musk's mining freighters in the asteroid belt so that they can pay off my student loans, right? Then the meaningful distinction for my grandchildren between what they're living and feudalism is that they have an appointed time of day when that buzzer's going to go off and they have to go down to the mines, right?
Yeah.
But structurally, very little has actually been altered.
Yeah, but I think that that's also an important distinction, because I think that there are like internal limits to growth under feudalism that are different from limits to growth under capitalism. So I think, part of what we're getting at here is not just about economics and about production, but is also about the state and its function and its relationship to capital, right? So one of the ways that people tend to characterize feudalism in non-economic terms, or at least European feudalism, is in the disappearance of public jurisdiction, right? So you used to have Carolingian like public authority, right? These people were also privately powerful lords, but they had sort of an independent office that was like sort of grounded, at least notionally, in a state, right? This gradually disappears. Public comital, meaning run by counts, courts disappear, and you have basically the proliferation of like private dispute arbitration. And for a lot of scholars, this is really what's at the core of a feudal society, is that there is no independent public sphere, and everything like legally and juridically has been privatized, right? In addition to like the commons being privatized, right? But I guess the distinction I would draw is I would say like, so for me as a Marxist, I think that demise of the public sphere in European feudalism is not a necessary outcome of like the feudal part necessarily. I think it has to do with the specific ways in which feudalism works in early medieval Europe. And that is to say that because that feature, that sort of total privatization of law and government, is not structurally linked to feudalism necessarily, it can also potentially emerge under future permutations of capitalism. I think most people, now know, and they now know that the sort of libertarian antithesis of the state and the market is a fiction, and that in fact you need states to develop markets, right? I think that's like true historically, and I think it's also like true theoretically. But it could be the case that once you've kind of had this like capitalist takeoff, not to like borrow a term from development and economics, but like once you sort of have had that necessary like state incubation, you can wind up in a situation where the state is no longer autonomous from capital, or is not autonomous in any meaningful sense. It's actually, I mean, this is what people mean when they talk about state capture, right? Which is a term that is like, I think, a theoretical term I often see attributed to like South African Leninists, but I actually think the World Bank came up with it first when they were talking about sort of de-Sovietification, right? They were concerned about like new government ministries basically being like taken over by what libertarians like to call crony capitalism, right? And they were right. I mean, that's exactly what happened. But so that's to say that like that kind of intense privatization of all kinds of public sphere, not just the commons, but also legal institutions, whatever, education. Yes, that is something we see in certain moments in feudalism, but it's also stuff that we see like in the much more recent history of earlier moments in capitalism, right? I mean, you're talking about like asteroid mining. I mean, that's what actual mining towns looked like in this country not all that long ago. So I don't think we need to reach outside of capitalism as a conceptual framework to like talk about what this theoretical future looks like, right?
The billionaires won the pandemic.
Absolutely, yeah.
The most powerful people in our society increased their share of wealth in the last year by a margin which even in the Gilded Age would have just staggered people.
Yeah.
The only visible cracks that I could see were those like in the healthcare system, and even those weren't even like that visibly noticed by the public. Everything else, I mean, 100% the billionaires won. So
it's pretty easy to see how, if you had built a society like the one that we have right now, and then that society was subjected to a big shock, right? The only people who are actually going to be positioned to profit from it, or to remain relative to everyone else on their trajectory or in a position of benefit, right, would be the most wealthy and the most powerful people, right? And so in the context of the story of Farfa, we can see how the monarchy, right, is a vessel for, this hereditary authority, right? And that ultimately, regardless of how many generations of fail son monks that you were going to get from Farfa, that at some point King Hugh is going to remember, is going to have on his ledger books who these monks are, or at least who their grandparents were. And when eventually power and opportunity and stability return, that they're going to go back into those ledgers and they're going to give the descendants of the fail sons their monastery back.
Well, and I think more than it being a case of like, a government reestablishing itself and then giving things out. I mean, I think that really the reconstitution of Farfa is itself like constitutive of the return to normalcy, basically. But so one of the sort of like grand narratives that, you know, is now rightly kind of out of fashion about medieval Europe, especially sort of around and after the year 1000, is that after this collapse of public power, the collapse of, you know, the counts disappear, right? You have the rise of the castellans, who are this sort of lower nobility who are powerful because they have weapons and because they control castles, and they're basically small warlords, right? And for a long time, people thought that these were a class of new men, right? To borrow from like more modern terminology. But what subsequent scholarship has revealed is that by and large, all of these castellans, their great great grandfathers were important people in the Carolingian state, right? And that even with the kind of total collapse of legitimate sort of effective Carolingian power in the sort of later 9th century, you know, the way that they exercised power may have changed, but ultimately it was mostly the same families who were calling the shots. In terms of what happens to your average peasant when like a new power moves in, whether or not that's like a band of Muslim pirates or of, you know, Christian bandits who subsequently, actually, in the case of Farfet, displaced the Muslims, we think. How much of a difference that actually makes to you as a peasant, I really have no idea in this period. And I don't think that we can say, at least not without extrapolating from evidence from much further afield.
This is an independently produced podcast. You can support us by subscribing and help us make more episodes by going to our Patreon page. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.